Olá a todos, bom dia a todos, muito obrigada pela vossa presença. I will now switch to English since our official language of the Scientia meetings is in English. Thank you all for your presence, for joining us for another Scientia meeting now online. Thank you all for your presence. I would like also to thank the presence and accepting the invitation of Isabel Queirós Neves, our speaker today, and also of Professor Manuela Sinsin, coordinator of the Natural History and Systematics group, where Isabel Queirós Neves also developed her PhD, to whom I will give the floor in a few minutes. So before I give the floor to Professor Manuela Sinsin, I would just like to thank you again for your presence and invite you during this session to leave your questions in the live chat that you have on your right here on YouTube. During the session, you can leave all your questions here on your right, and after the presentation by Isabel Queirós Neves, we will have a few minutes for questions, and I will give the questions to Isabel. So now I give the floor to Professor Manuela Sinsin. Thank you for your presence. And I would also like to thank the team that is here today, sorry. Besides me, Marta Santos, who is from the communication office from C3C, we also have here today in the backstage, Mariana Marques, who is ensuring that everything goes well. So thank you also, Mariana. And now I give the words to Manuela Sinsin. Thank you.
So thank you, Marta. Thank you very much. Good morning to everyone, to those colleagues that are in the YouTube, to special also to Isabel Queirós Neves, and I give her congratulations for having concluded her PhD very recently in a subject that fits very well in the research developed by the group of Natural History and Systematics. In fact, I would like to point that it's quite important that natural collections material could be used as a background for such studies as you have developed, together with the data of biodiversity as SBIF, and together with the possibility to have recent data on the field work about diversity of animals, in this case of mammals from Mozambique, it's quite important to develop gap analysis and to point areas important to keep the biodiversity and to improve the conservation of the biodiversity of these important components of fauna in areas of Africa, in this case of Oriental Africa, and such studies are key points to know better the areas that deserve a better research in the future. Also, connecting with the origins of fauna, it's really important to have a good knowledge about the distribution of different taxonomic groups, and in this case of mammals, and know where several key species are dominant, and maybe point several measures for the future improvement of the communities where they developed, and envisaging also all the context of global changes that we are living. Also, of course, the subject related with the social items is really important, and I think that a good knowledge, just to conclude, a good knowledge on the biodiversity in situ, the knowledge that we can always get with the natural collection, which is essential to have a good study and a good background on biodiversity, and also the data on biodiversity portals as SBIF are, together with the literature data, are essential for this kind of approach and in other areas with other taxonomic groups. So thank you again, Isabel, and I wish you a good conference, and thank you also to all colleagues. Thank you.
Should I start? Yeah. Okay. Good morning to all. Thank you to the C3EC for the invitation, to Marta Santos and to Manuela Cinci for the kind presentation. So here I'm going to share my slides for my presentation. I'm going to present a work developed during my PhD thesis under the title Terrestrial Mammals of Mozambique, Current Knowledge and the Future Challenges for Conservation. My supervisors were Cristiano Bastos Silveira and Professora Maria da Luz de Matias. And the work, I belong to the doctoral program of Biology and Ecology for Global Change. So my thesis was born from this wish to contribute to an updated knowledge on the occurrence and distribution of the mammal fauna in Mozambique and examine the challenges for their conservation. In this presentation, I'm going to focus a little bit on the scope of my work, then do a little introduction to the concepts and thematics, and then go through the objectives and the main results, and finalize with a synthesis and think a little bit about the future challenges. So this study was developed in the realm of biodiversity informatics, which I believe is a discipline that through the informatic tools could enable the communication between the academy and the scientific community and the government and the industry through the interpretation of data in digital infrastructures with the tools for data analysis, data management, and data collection. And so the primal information needed in biodiversity informatics is the primary biodiversity data, which is data that give us information of the occurrence of a particular species at a given point in time and space. This information could be related to natural history specimens, or could be trapped inside a piece of paper with their geographic information and their location. And the mobilization of such a data is really crucial, and it is an opportunity mainly for countries with poorly documented, for a better management of their natural resources. In the last decades, we have been observing an exponential increase in the availability and accessibility of primary biodiversity data through portals such as GBIF, Global Biodiversity Information Facility. However, even though we have this enhancement in data availability, we can observe global unevenness and gaps in the distribution of this data. We can look here at this image. It's a work from 2015 by Mayer, and it shows for vertebrates that the countries more biodiverse are also the countries with less data accessible to describe their diversity, and Mozambique is one of these countries. So, and this is the country where I focus my study. Mozambique is an extensive country with more than 800,000 square kilometers, located in the South Hemisphere in the subequatorial tropical zone. It's varied, is diverse in ecosystems with composed of 13 ecoregions. In Mozambique, the lack of data, I'm just going to The lack of data is limiting the effective protection of species. And furthermore, recent reports on the national strategy and action plans in the country identify the limited knowledge and the limited use for decision making as indirect causes of threats to biodiversity. In this country, long war periods, the pressure for economic development, the lack of specialized personnel, regular climatic events, all of these factors contributed to directly and indirectly to an insufficient knowledge and incomplete of its fauna across various taxonomic groups. In this thesis, I focus on mammals and terrestrial mammals, which is a group that are not only ecological important, but also with a great socioeconomic value, and particularly for a country in which 80% of the population depends on the goods and products of nature, where mammals are not only a source of protein, they are a source of income, and they are the attraction in safari tourism, which most of the times ensures conservation. In Mozambique, in comparison to the neighboring countries, the knowledge that exists regarding the mammal fauna is particularly scarce. The previous complete and comprehensive checklist published dates of over 30 years ago and was compiled by Smithers and Lobantello in 1976. And gives for Mozambique 190 terrestrial mammals. So the objectives of my thesis go for a comprehensive and updated knowledge regarding this fauna. And so the main objectives were to compile a comprehensive dataset of primary species occurrence data, synthesize and describe the available information, contextualize and understand the patterns of this knowledge and its gaps, and contribute with the path for conservation studies and inform decision making for preservation of the mammal diversity. And so looking at these objectives, we may say that my thesis, or the road I took in my thesis, pretty much follows this diagram of data, information, knowledge, and arriving to a more informed decision making. So starting from data, in which I'm going to now describe the sources and the process in the compilation of data. I've used 5 main data sources. The GBIF platform, from which I obtained data from 35 different institutions, sources of specimen data and observation data. And I also contacted directly other 8 natural history museums that had their data from their specimens digitalized, for which we knew they had information on Mozambique. And then I digitalized data from scientific articles, 17 recent articles. I digitalized information from the checklists, and I digitized information from recent survey reports, most of them after the year 2000, from recent expeditions, localized expeditions, and also wildlife countrywide surveys. In this way, I obtained more than 17,000 registries of mammal fauna raw data to begin with. However, before being introduced into a standardized database that was constructed for the effect, the data were passed through a a rigorous and thorough process of cleaning and mining and improvement that passed through the taxonomic update of the name of the species, the georeferentiation of the localities, update of locality names, data standardization. All of this resulted in data with better quality for subsequent analysis. And this part of the work was where I spent most of the time of my thesis. Most of the records I had to manually curate them individually. Now we go to the second stage, the one when I wish to describe and give context to the information collected. And thinking of species checklists as a powerful instrument for the description of a region's biodiversity, this is where I started. How? From the raw data and regarding the specimen data, to distinguish between species that had good support for their inclusion in the final checklist and species that didn't have good support information for their inclusion in the specialist. We created this framework in which a species to be part of the checklist, when it was only based on specimen data, they had to be collected by different collectors in different times. And they had to, if only collected by a single collector, then they had to be referenced already in the Smithers and Tello checklists. In this way, this process enables to create two lists, the species checklist, for which we gave for the country, reported for the country, 217 species, which results in an addition of 37 species for the country in relation to the previous checklist, and a list of species with questionable occurrence in Mozambique, composed with 23 species for which their information is not sufficient to be sure they exist in the country. So this list is very important. So from here, we can now go after these specimens that give this species, try to understand if they actually exist in the country or not. And looking more particularly into the data obtained, we observed that 1/4 of the species in the species checklist lacks recent records, in that being we don't have information on their occurrence after the year 2000. Particularly, we can see here in the blue box, for the rodentia, for the rodents, more than 40% of the species do not have recent records. And for carnivora, a very important group, for 12 species, we do not have recent records. Another important observation we made was that it were the orders, the mammal orders with the smaller animals that were the least known. And so now we go to the third stage, when we try to understand the patterns of this knowledge compiled. In this thesis, I decided to do a geographic mapping of this information throughout the territory to understand and where the gaps are localized. And so by calculating the environmental bias and the inventory completeness throughout the territory, we understand that less than 5% was considered well known. And from this knowledge, we then decided to compare the gaps of knowledge from based on old data and gaps of knowledge based on recent data to try to understand if there was a changing pattern in recent years where expeditions and observations were being registered. In this work and following the work by Sousa Baena, we mapped gaps in knowledge as the areas that are not only geographically distant from the well-known areas, but also that are environmentally different from the well-known sites. And so in this way, we could observe the areas that are the least visited in the past and recently. So are the areas where we know that we could probably obtain new species, new occurrences for the country. We obtain areas that are sufficiently documented throughout time, and they are places that we could choose to try to document shifts in the distribution of species and try to understand some mechanisms, and places which we observe that are not being visited in recent years, and places that we should understand if they keep their natural habitats and try to avoid the discontinuity in the monitoring effort. We now go to the fourth stage, the one where we wish to go a little bit into the informed decision making. In here, I examined decisions taken in the past for the conservation of species, and tried to think about the effects of these decisions in the conservation nowadays. In Mozambique, conservation areas, most of the conservation areas were initially implemented for the conservation of the bigger species, the megafauna. Most of the conservation areas were implemented in the 50s to the 70s, where for the conservation of the bigger species, the elephant, the giraffe, or as coutadas are for hunting. And so thinking about this and thinking because of the wide census being done throughout the country, they are aerial census. So they tell us that for the megafauna, we know that the bigger densities of megafauna are located inside the conservation areas. So I came with this question to understand how are the least known species, the smallest species, being preserved in this network of conservation areas, currently and in the future. How? And so I selected from the initial checklist the 122 species of mammals with the less than 5 kilograms, and performed niche models to obtain their climatic niche of distribution. And following the protection target established by Rodrigues et al., we observed that less than 30% of the small-sized mammals were not sufficient. Only 30% were sufficiently protected across the conservation areas network, and that the restricted range species were the ones that were not protected at all throughout the country. We also went to see forecasting for 2015 in the business as usual scenario, how these species would be preserved, or if how their climatic niches would change. And by doing this, we realized that we obtained equivalent levels of protection to the current climatic predictions, but that for more than half the species, there is a suitable range loss, a climatic niche loss. And taking this into account, we also proposed 13 priority zones for mammal protection in the future, considering not only the centers of high richness of non-protected species, but also centers of rarity that we consider as centers of richness of restricted range species. Also, we account for climate change and for areas with bigger anthropogenic pressure. So I'm going to do now a synthesis of the thesis. I believe this illustration tells us a lot about what was available and now is available for after this study into describing the mammal fauna of Mozambique. So at the beginning, we see here in A, the digital accessible data through online portals. Before this study, that was possible to map. It's what we see here in A. After the data quality improvement in terms of georeferencing of this data, we have a little bit of improvement, but most improvement comes from the digitization of the gray and the scientific literature. So we put here a great effort that should be done into the digitization of the literature and their open access. So I believe that the main achievements of the thesis are the production of a unique baseline resources, which is a comprehensive and extensive compilation of information on the occurrence and distribution of mammals reported for Mozambique, and the characterization of the major knowledge trends. And in the two papers we published, we suggest path for future studies. And now, thinking about some of the results we obtained, we can now think about more challenges or more questions to try to answer in the following work that could be done in the country, in Mozambique, and globally. With 1/4 of the species lacking recent records, we started thinking, are these species still present in the country? Is there work being done that's not being shared? Are there means for their open access to improve the accessibility of this work? Northern Mozambique continues to be the least known region in the country. And how different is the diversity of species in this region? This region, many times and for many taxonomic groups, appears to be with less diversity from the rest of the country. But is this result really true? Or Northern Mozambique is biogeographically so different that contains a completely different fauna? Small-sized mammals were not sufficiently protected across the conservation areas network. How can we include these species in the management plans? What needs to be done to include these species, which now we know, and we know for many years, but now it's critical in this new normal we'll see, that the small-sized mammals play a particular role in maintaining our world healthy. And knowing that central Mozambique is particularly vulnerable to climate change, how can we maintain conservation as a priority given global change and this new normal? In a country where conservation depends mainly in the tourism, how can we maintain conservation in such a region? So my work basically did this first turn and this wheel to try to arrive from a first data set to discussed decision making for conservation. But there should be a global effort, and it is a global challenge for these poorly known regions, not only for informed decision making for effective conservation of species, but also decision making for better data, ensuring the dissemination of work being done inside these countries, as we realize that reports and expeditions being done in the country give a lot of information about the diversity of the species in this country, in these countries, talking about poorly known regions, and ensure open access and ensure funding for digitalization of data. I want to thank my supervisors that supported me from through all these years during my PhD thesis, and the FCT for the scholarship. And I leave you with this sentence by David Attenborough, and that the complexity of nature is what we must do our utmost to protect, and that our health depends on its health. Thank you very much. Now we're going to Q&A.
Thank you. Thank you, Isabel, very much for this very interesting presentation and for lots of questions that we now have given your research, lots of questions for future research that you also have. We now have time for a few questions, and I invite you to leave your questions on the live chat that you have on the right on YouTube. And I see that we are receiving right now, and I thank you for that, a few questions on YouTube, and we will go to that in a minute. I know that Professor Manuela had one question, so I invite Professor Manuela to give you for your one question, and then we will switch to the questions on YouTube. So Professor Manuela, I give you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marta. Many congratulations for Isabel for this very interesting presentation. I have one question concerning your work, and I would like to know, how do you consider that if it will be possible in a near future to get a better knowledge in some specific areas of Mozambique about the diversity of mammals, mainly those species that can be more endangered, or some key species as endemic species, and how do you consider that envisaging the development of a future red list? Thank you.
Yeah, the red list would be a crucial tool for Mozambique, I believe. And I think that some work is being done in that sense. What we did was pretty much an outsider view of a country, and what I think it's pretty relevant is that the work being done inside the country, and there is a lot of effort being done by a lot of organizations and by the universities in Mozambique. And I really think that this work should come out, and if they could come out as a tool for informed decision making globally, because the lack of data not only impacts the country, but impacts global decisions being done. So Mozambique always appears in a lot of global maps as a place that has less diversity than the neighbor countries. So I think this effort should be done so that globally everyone knows that that country has as many species as the one on the side. And globally, another thing I've noticed is that, for instance, UCN maps do not cover the country for the least known species. And sometimes they follow the frontiers of the country. So I don't know what happens, but that species does not go to the other side of the border for Mozambique. And because I don't believe that species know borders, that probably is not the case. And Mozambique contains a lot of more diversity of species. I think that my work points directions where to focus our efforts. And for a country that should think a lot about their resources for conservation, my work points where we could focus our effort for research and for surveys in the near future. So I think we could begin in those places that my work identified and go forth. And it could be a great, I think, a resourceful strategy for the near surveys being done in the country. And I think we are still a little bit behind the knowledge to know which are the key species, we don't have enough information to identify that species yet, from what I know, because I know that people that work there perhaps and probably know much more, but that information is enclosed in the country.
Yes. Thank you very much, Isabel, for your clear answer. And I think you are in the good way.
Thank you, Isabel. I will now switch to a few questions that we have now on YouTube. I will start by grouping here one comment and one question that I think that are related. So forgive me, the people that pose these questions if they are not completely related, but I think that you will understand my reasoning. So we have a comment by Vernust. I hope I'm pronouncing right. So he starts by saying, good job, very interesting. You could now try to evaluate or assess the connectivity between those hotspots of biodiversity, particularly in the face of the infrastructure development. So it's a comment and a suggestion in terms of connectivity between hotspots of biodiversity. And I add another question, which I think can be related, by Gonçalo Corveira Santos, who also says, thank you for this nice presentation. And Vernust is Fernando Ascensão. Gonçalo Corveira Santos has a question. How did you account for spatial knowledge gaps when implementing the niche models and assessing conservation area coverage?
Could you please repeat the second one so that I cover everything?
The second question by Gonçalo Corveira Santos is, how did you account for spatial knowledge gaps when implementing the niche models and assessing conservation area coverage? Okay.
So the first point of connectivity between conservation areas, that's probably the first job I will try with my data, not only for the small sized mammals but for the large mammals, because one of the more important conservation areas in Mozambique is Gorongosa National Park, which is now being extended. And it's one of the areas that we know is going to be highly affected by climate change and extreme events. So the species that exist here and that are being protected will need a place to go and a place to adapt. So we need to ensure that they are corridors between conservation areas, in the country. So that would be a work I would like to try with the data I have. If I can answer a little bit this, if I can give some clues on this information. Another thing was to take into account in infrastructures. What I did when planning on trying to discover priority areas for conservation was I took into account human footprint index. So I tried to look for places with less human impact and places with less population density in the future. So using predictions of human population density, I try to do this not only for now with human impact, but also for the future with increase in human population. I did not use infrastructures, but they are related with one another, and human footprint has that into account. And when I did my niche models, I knew that the main gaps of knowledge are in the North Mozambique. So every result had to take this into account. And to try to cover the climatic niche of the species, I used not only the data I had collected regarding Mozambique, but I also add data from neighboring countries to try to capture the climatic niche of the species more, I do not want to say correctly, but try to more close to reality, the climatic niche. So I used points from neighbor countries as well to try to capture the climatic niche. This is not, and then when I decided on these priority areas, I also took into account human footprint. So these are areas that could potentially be good for the implementation of conservation areas. That's how I took everything into account. Considering that there are gaps of knowledge, I use data from neighboring countries to try to consider all the environmental envelope of the species. I don't know if I answered everything.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Isabel. We have a few more questions here. We have first a comment by Filipe Coutinho Soares, who thanks you for your presentation, for your interesting presentation. I will now group two more questions. We have one question which I think you already kind of answered, but you can also add a few more comments if you want to. A question by Graça Oliveira, who also thanks you for your presentation and asks, do you have reasons to suspect or to suppose there are unreported surveys, or is it just wishful thinking? And Graça adds that perhaps you have already answered in your reply to Manuela, but if you want to ask, add a few more comments, you are welcome to. And I add a second question now that we have here, so we are grouping a few questions. Another question by Teresa Santos, who thanks you also for this talk. And Teresa wonders if you found any biases in reporting sources. For example, if most recent reports came from studies from Mozambican or South African universities.
So, regarding the unreported surveys, I know that the conservation organizations in Mozambique and the government with the ministry that is responsible for this, the wildlife surveys, they're each since 2008. They have been performing regular, like in every 3 years, 4 years, a countrywide aerial survey that covers megafauna, essentially. So, but these reports are not shared online, but they have this information being done. I believe the last one was in 2018. Not all of this information I was able to include in my thesis. I had the first one because I started in 2011, and then the other ones I was not able to digitalize because everything is done in a paper format, so you have to georeference and digitalize the information to include it. So it's a long way to include this information. But I believe that information is digital for the ones that are doing the work locally. A lot of universities in Mozambique have master theses, PhD theses being done across the conservation areas and across the research interesting places across the country. And it's very difficult, I say by myself, to publish a paper on this area about Mozambique. It's a challenge. So what I believe is, if it was a challenge for me, it surely is a challenge for someone in Mozambique to publish their results. So I'm certain that there is a lot of information in the country that it's not integrated in global reports. But I know that there's also an effort to build a platform for biodiversity data in the country. And I hope that in the next years, all researchers and students will be able to access it and to produce better informed decisions. And regarding the bias in the reports, most of the wildlife reports I used are produced by consulting companies that are specialized in this. So the government pays for a company to perform the report. And this happens not only for the wildlife reports, but also for the reports under the Convention of Biological Diversity. Sometimes there are reports by the Universidade Eduardo Mondlane in Maputo or other universities, but these big ones usually are with the support of a consultant. And there are also a lot of researchers from the Gorongosa National Park that came from or Zimbabwe or South Africa that help in this first, basically the first surveys being done in the country across the conservation areas. Also, what I see for the North Mozambique, there was a big project concerning the Inselberg areas in Mozambique that was from the UK. So we had a lot of researchers from the UK that went to Mozambique to do expeditions, not only regarding mammals, but mostly regarding plants and reptiles and birds sometimes. So,
okay, thank you, Isabel. And in the meantime, Graça Oliveira also added a comment that I think meets your answer. Graça Oliveira added, do you know if local unreported surveys are being done in northern Mozambique? I'm thinking about the long-lasting warlike status in this part of the country. So I think it meets your answer, what you were saying, right?
Yeah, in North Mozambique we have two big conservation areas: the Niassa National Park and Quirimbas. These are the biggest one. And when they were Quirimbas first implemented and IASA recovered, a lot of work was being developed by students from Mozambique. So there are a lot of students that went to these areas to perform work. From Quirimbas, they also focused on smaller species, not only the megafauna. And IASA, we have little information regarding the smaller species. Of course, the conflicts now in the country put a little bit of worry, and if not only this part of the country will be affected, the wildlife, not only, of course, the people first, but then the wildlife would be affected by these conflicts if it gains a bigger dimension, and if it also makes the students and the researchers less eager to go to those areas to study them, not only foreign but also from the country. On the other hand, these conflicts would probably keep, and I'm saying this as an anecdote, would keep industries far away. So probably if they give up the big projects in Mozambique, that would be somehow good, but we have to find another way to ensure the people's survival in the country.
Thank you. And we have one final comment by Paulo Eduardo Cardoso on YouTube. He says, "Good work, Isabel. I've worked with all of these recent data from aerial surveys, both Mozambique and PA surveys with Maputo Natural History Museum team. WCS have collected a lot of data on species distribution, and it would be good to join efforts and build an open and extensive platform with all the data available so far." So we have here a possibility for collaboration. I don't know if you want to add something, and this would be our last comment before we close the session.
Yeah, the data I collected or I collated during my PhD thesis will be available as a data set in the next, is already available, but GBIF Portugal gave me the opportunity to publish it as a data set in their site. So this way we ensure that not only we're able to keep updating it, to share it, to include it in another platform, but also to try to keep the species checklist updated. Every time we have a new species, the species checklist is also up to date. So that's a opportunity that I'm going to grab right now and focus, so that everyone that is able to do work on Mozambique in the next years, in the short term, will have access to the data I collected.
Thank you. So thank you once again. So it's time to wrap up our session. Thank you once again, Isabel, for accepting our invitation and for your very interesting talk. Thank you, Professor Manuela, also for your presence and for your intervention, for your presentation here of Isabel. Thank you, Mariana, here on the backstage, who ensured that everything went well. And thank you all for your presence here and for following this session. And I invite you to follow our next session next week on the July 2nd with the researcher Adriel Rodrigues with the topic Shimajitu Urban Farms. So at the same time at 11 a.m. So please keep following our talks. It will be the last Scientia meeting of this academic year. And thank you.